Okay, well, thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Again, my name is Alex Oliver. I'm a financial advisor with First National Corporation and running this webinar today in affiliation with Schwartz and Schwartz Accountants. This is a part of our financial boot camp series, and today we're going to be talking about generational wealth transfer, 10 best practices. I'm going to be going over several materials today, and I also do have some takeaways at the end of this presentation if you'd like some of that emailed over that to you. So just keep in mind that and stick around toward the end. Just as a brief introduction for First National Corporation, our firm, we're based in Rockland, Massachusetts, which is on the south shore of the Boston area, down near Hingham and Cohasset. We're a registered investment advisor regulated by the SEC. We provide independent, unbiased advice, conflict-free advice, and we serve as a fiduciary to our clients, which means that legally we have to act in our best interest of our clients. Not every advisor works that way, but we certainly do and have been for quite some time. We have two sides to our practice: wealth management, which is where I spend most of my time working with families, usually in the 45 and up stage, to plan for retirement and plan for wealth transfer topics such as today. And then certainly we have a dedicated retirement practice. We work with a little over 50 401k and 403b plans in around the Boston and southern New Hampshire area, serving as a fiduciary to those plans, selecting investments, and providing education. So getting on to education, just as a reminder, if you haven't seen some of our past webinars, this is our fourth in 2019 on our final financial boot camp. We do have the recordings of the previous boot camps. We had previously talked about get what's yours, maximizing your Social Security, all sorts of claiming strategies around that decision, an economic and investment overview for 2019 back in February. So a little over a month now. You can see if any of the things we talked about has come to fruition so far. Why do stocks go up and down? Just a very basic introduction to how stock markets work, might help you feel more comfortable when you see your portfolios going up and down. And then finally today, again, generational wealth transfer. So if you want to see those recordings, I would head over to schwartzaccountants.com/events. We also did this last year, and so we've got several different kinds of webinars up there. A lot of different things about year-end tax planning. We've got things for student loans. If we've got some of the younger folk in this webinar today, we talk about estate planning, which is different than what we'll be talking about today. Other issues around college costs and the rest. So feel free to again head over to schwartzaccountants.com/events, and all those webinars are offered on demand. Okay, so one last thing, just a little housekeeping disclosure. Just to be sure that everybody understands that anything I talk about today is something I'm going to be talking about on a broad, very general level, certainly not giving any advice. I would certainly be talking to your estate planner or your financial advisor before enacting any principles that we discussed today. Okay, so let's talk about generational wealth transfer. Certainly a big topic. This is a time when, our baby boomers, there's just so many that are retiring, so many that are aging. It's estimated that around $30 trillion is going to be moving from the baby boomers' hands over to their children or to their charities over the next 30 years. So that's a significant amount of money. And then as you can see, this statistic here, studies have shown that around 70% of your overall family wealth is lost by the end of the second generation and 90% by the end of the third, so your grandchildren. That's a incredible statistic, and frankly not that surprising when you see it in action. And again, maybe you've seen other loved ones that maybe haven't taken a really proactive approach to their estate or wealth transfer plan, and you can see those funds squandered. So this presentation today, trying to set that up and give you some strategies and some ideas to ensure that you don't end up becoming part of that statistic. And a big thing we're going to harp on today is really around the aspect of communication. Studies have shown that fear is really the dominant emotion that prevents people from communicating to their heirs about their wealth. That could be fear about running out of money. So you might be 65 and you're just not sure that you're going to have any money by the time you're 95. So why even bother talking to my children if they don't know what kind of inheritance is going to be? It's just a far off concept right now. There might be a fear about creating entitlement mentality in your children or your heirs. So if they know that they've got hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars coming their way, they might start to act a little bit differently in the next 5 or 10 years. You might have fear that they're going to squander their inheritance over time. You might have fear that there will be outside influences overtaking your heirs. So maybe the families that they've married into, they might have some effect of what will happen when they actually receive those funds. So there's just a lot of reasons that we find parents don't end up communicating their financial and estate planning goals. And so this, really can lead to children misunderstanding that there are, certain conditions or certain ideas on the inheritance that you created for them to provide lifelong stability or comfort. And they may interpret a promised inheritance as a license to be lazy or complacent while waiting to play the sort of inheritance lottery, if you will. So, as we go through these principles today, for better or for worse, I've actually had the opportunity in the last couple of weeks to see a situation through that was done very well, where one of my clients passed away in their 80s. And luckily, just about 4 months ago, I had met the children for the first time. We didn't talk about dollar figures. We didn't talk about how much my client had in assets to leave behind, but we did get on the same page just, philosophically with what was happening and how that money was being managed. And now that, she has passed away and we're certainly talking to the children in more detail, it has made that process exponentially easier. And again, I know that we're all on the same page with what will be happening. So I definitely will refer back to that example as we continue along here, okay? One thing I do want to make clear before we go too far is that estate planning certainly does not equal wealth transfer. So with estate planning, hopefully by now you've, hopefully by now you've sat down with an estate attorney, you've put a will in place or a trust, you've set up durable power of attorneys and a healthcare proxy and things of that nature. These things are really to protect your assets, maybe even mitigate estate taxes if you're here in the state of Massachusetts, but they're not really necessarily, unless you have a really detailed trust, they're not necessarily talking about what's going to happen to the money after it's transferred, after your heirs have it. Because really, I don't necessarily recommend having a lot of controls over that. Your children should, be able to have some say in what will happen. But wealth transfer is really going to talk about the communication aspect of, how much might be coming, what it should be used for, what its intention was, why you've been sacrificing the last 20 years to save this money to provide to them. So again, we want to make sure we have some of these conversations, and I'm going to give you some ideas as to, what kinds of things that we might talk about as we go along. Okay, so thinking of monetary wealth as part of a larger picture. Oh, sorry, I'm not sure why it keeps doing that. Although monetary wealth is important for your family security, it's important to consider monetary assets as part of a much larger family legacy. So a successful transfer of wealth should be including family values, stories, traditions, maybe even different aspects of your own culture. So, as it says here, wealth transfer means not just uniting your family behind your assets, but more importantly, aligning those assets with the morals and standards of your family that cherishes most. That might mean continuing on a charitable organization that you started or a foundation, or maybe continuing contributions to, say, a church that you've been contributing to thus far, but haven't, sent all of your assets to prior to bequeathing them to your heirs. Those kinds of conversations could be part of the conversation now as you start to leave these assets behind. Number two, setting up a mentoring system, certainly something I don't really see very often with my clients, because again, I don't know that there's really necessarily a lot of structure as to how we might go around setting up that mentoring system. So making time to educate, nurture, collaborate with your future heirs can really mean a big difference between a successful wealth transfer and the loss of your family legacy. There's a statistic that says about 25% of your wealth transfers are caused by inadequately prepared heirs. So, when you think about the people that you're leaving your money behind, are they educated on financial matters? Do they know what the difference is between IRAs or Roth IRAs, or the tax consequences of the accounts that you're going to be inheriting and what they need to consider? Or if they're going to be inheriting a family business, maybe there's some issues around that as well, or maybe issues around the property inheritance. So, investing in that next generation is really important. If they can learn to respect money and getting an education on certain economic concepts, it might take care of traps that they might run into with careless spending down the road. So books, classes, or even working with an advisor, working with the advisor you work with now, I know that for our clients, we really try to make a push that when their children get to be 16, 17, 18, maybe we'll just set up a Roth IRA for them. As soon as they start to work, they can start contributing to that Roth IRA. It can grow tax-free. They can actually use that money for a first-time home purchase when they're 25, 30 years old. And they can see how that money fluctuates with the stock market. So that way they don't panic when their first recession happens. So they can go through that at a young age when it's not such an important issue. You could start this process even earlier. We have clients that start up custodial accounts and they may just buy Disney stock or Hasbro or Mattel. And then that allows them to have a conversation about, hey, we went to Disney World, we gave them a bunch of our money, and this is how the company makes money off that. This is how your account gets affected, in both good and bad economies. So setting up a mentoring system as early as possible, there's a lot of ways to do that, and I would really encourage going down that road. So number 3, practicing family governance, sort of touching on something I said earlier, whereas, when you're making decisions as a family, you can really develop and practice family governance through informal family meetings, which provide a forum for family members to speak as equals so that all generations feel that they're having their voices heard. So, establishing this type of discussion can help your family develop policies that guide how you're going to go making decisions. So when you create a model on how to make these important choices regarding family wealth, your family is more likely to avoid conflict. So for more formal practice, you could set up a shared philanthropy, as I mentioned earlier, such as a foundation or a donor-advised fund. A lot of our clients will bring their children into helping with the donor-advised fund and pushing assets out. That gets them involved, getting them involved with a family business, obviously, if that's an issue for you. But by giving that sort of framework early on, they can develop really valuable decision-making skills while they still have the previous generation to guide them through those skills. And again, you can certainly monitor that, as we'll talk about a little bit further. Okay. Establishing a plan for conflict resolution, certainly, an issue that gets avoided here because we hope that we don't have to run into this. But, when dealing with money, especially during the emotional time after a family member has died, it's very common, even for the most peaceful families, to run into issues with how to divvy up assets, even if it's just personal possessions. So, many families think that if they avoid conflict at all costs, there's no need to think about conflict resolution. But that's really, a mistake. While you're going to be long gone at this stage, you really want to make sure that, the 2 or 3 children that you leave behind don't come to some catastrophic argument during this process that, leaves them no longer communicating with each other, and something that you wouldn't want to have happen. So some ideas, again, cultural differences from one generation to the next. Certainly you grew up in a certain time and they've grown up in a certain time. There's bound to be different opinions about how assets might be handled depending on who's managing it. So setting up a framework as to how you might come to a resolution around that, or naming somebody in charge of those conversations. There might be issues where one of your children has a medical emergency that comes up, before you pass away. And you might want to have a conversation with the other children. If that were to happen, I am going to help out that child that has the medical emergency. Part of their inheritance is going to be given to them now during my life versus later on. Or maybe one of your children goes to a more expensive college than the other 2 children, and you will have to decide whether you want to make that up either during life or as you transfer wealth over, or if you don't want to deal with that issue at all. And, again, just things that might bring up conflicts where, if I went to a really inexpensive school, but one of my siblings went to a really expensive school, maybe I expect a larger inheritance because of that. I don't know. It's a conversation that maybe you can nip in the butt to get taken care of now. Okay. Finally, I guess I would just bring up, what happens if one of your children spends their inheritance too quickly. There are definitely cases where, somebody who has been living paycheck to paycheck, you can think of lottery winners as an example. They get this large sum of money and then they find a way to spend it, very quickly, and they run out of money. Will the other siblings help out at that point in time? Again, maybe there's a conversation to be had around that. My guess is probably no, but at least if you have that conversation up front and that then occurs 5 or 10 years later, everybody's on the same page, maybe even put it in writing, so that way it's something to call back to. Okay, along those same lines of evaluating individual risk, no two families are the same here, and one of the best parts of wealth transfer is that they can be customized to best fit your family. So, the chances that their spending habits, their attitudes, and maturity levels, are pretty high at this point. You've seen them for years, and again, hopefully, if you've set up Roth IRAs for them, or set up accounts for them already, you've been able to monitor that over time. So, these are all things to consider before meeting with your financial advisor so that you can help customize risk profiles for each family, for each member in your family. And maybe that means setting up trust rather than giving money directly to the heirs of a certain age. So some people will set up a trust where, my children get a certain amount of money at age 25 and a certain amount of money at age 30. I'm not really a fan of that unless it's a really specific circumstance, but it is something that, again, people do, so it's something to consider. So, I guess I would also bring up that maybe the investments that they end up holding should also be different. If one of your children has is very financially literate and knows how stock markets work, they can probably have the same investments that you do. But if another is not really that experienced with having employer 401k plans or anything of that nature, the risk that you're taking in your portfolio may be way too high for one of your children, who might then sell all of those assets in a deep recession like we had in 2008. So, really customizing who's going to get what might be a really smart thing to do at this stage of the wealth transfer planning. Okay, so, getting organized, obviously leading into everything we've talked about so far, establishing early on how much you can afford to pass on, and how much you need to conserve. So how much will you need for your own retirement? How much do you think you're going to donate to charity, for example? And how much are you going to donate to your 2 or 3 children or to certain grandchildren? Usually our clients will separate their assets into core capital, which is the money you need, and it might just be on a fixed income or high dividend paying stock basis. And then excess capital, which would be the amount that you're putting toward the next generation. And that might be invested a little bit more aggressively with the idea that it's for long-term growth. This will ensure that you're not overspending your current portfolio or allocating too much money to the future, which is essentially what this slide talks about here. I do want to just show you part of the software system that we use for our clients. This is actually called our Decision Center. It's within a software called eMoney. And so once we have all of our client assets uploaded into this, and we can project out, for 20 or 30 years, this is just showing you this gray line here is just showing you what would happen if we did nothing to the portfolio. So if the assets, they pulled out what they needed to spend every year, and the assets grew at just say 5% per year, this client looks like they're around $7 million with just, slight raises here. We've switched this into present value just to show you what it looks like. But we've also thrown on some scenarios on the left-hand side here. So what would happen if they retired a year or two early? Obviously, that's going to drop their assets here. What would happen if we spent $100,000 extra for the next 20 years? And that might be to travel while you're in your early years of retirement. We've also thrown some scenarios on here for gifting. So we might use the annual exclusion to give $30,000 per year to each of our children. So what if we did that for the next 20 or 30 years? Or what if we donated $50,000 to 2 charities for the next 20 years? Or what if we had a long-term care event in 20 years from now? Even with all those scenarios switched on, this particular client doesn't actually run out of money. Now, this might be a little too close for comfort, getting to age 100 with $500,000 left when you started with 7 million. But I think it just at least emphasizes the point that once we start to throw on these scenarios, we can see, what is the comfortable amount. And I always encourage my clients to try and really, take a proactive approach to their financial plan, because this client, if they did nothing, they're going to be having, $7 million in present dollars throughout their retirement. It's way more than they need. So if they decide, that they want to gift to their kids or gift to charity, they're actually going to save in taxes, whether that's estate taxes or income taxes, by doing that. And again, by illustrating this, we're going to find out that they're not going to run out of money anyways. So I really love this. This is where I spend a lot of time with my 65 and older clients to really map out what does retirement look like. And then we'll even throw on other scenarios like what if we have a big stock market dip in the next 2 to 4 years? How does that affect it? So we can look at worst case scenarios and be very conservative with our plan. Okay, so if you're not working with First National Corporation or you have another advisor, I'm sure there's a way for you to map these kinds of scenarios out as well to see what you can and cannot afford. Okay, so getting back to our steps here, choosing your trustees wisely, certainly a big topic. A trustee is responsible for administering the money from a trust to its beneficiaries. So the trustee should understand the grantor's intent in creating the trust. They should know the beneficiaries well, and they should have the appropriate knowledge to monitor the investments within that trust. Unfortunately, not all trustees meet these criteria, and it can be tempting to choose a family member or a close friend or as a trustee, but many people don't have someone that's actually capable of carrying out those responsibilities. So there are other options. You might have another trusted advisor, or you could hire a corporate trustee or a private trust company. Those will have their own pros or cons, but you ultimately have to decide on the balance between the familiarity of the person and the experience that they have and what you're comfortable with. So, one other important and sometimes overlooked aspect of selecting a trustee is choosing a successor or a protector to ensure that your wealth is in good hands, no matter what happens. And, I just include this slide here, sort of the responsibilities of a trustee, just a small list here. But no, obviously a very large list, a lot of things going on for that trustee. So if you name your, son or daughter to be in that position, there's going to be a lot of things that they have to deal with that certainly they have no experience in doing. They've never had to be a trustee before. So, if you've got a significant estate, I'm not sure that it's necessarily the best thing to do. But if you are going to name them, I think having some conversation of what that actually means would be really helpful to them. So that way it's not, really dumped on their lap all of a sudden in one fell swoop. Okay. Getting close to the end here, so establishing set roles among beneficiaries. Just as important as choosing the right trustee is deciding who will be your beneficiaries and what roles and responsibilities they'll take on. So each beneficiary is expected to contribute to accomplishing their family's long-term goals in some way, but their role in achieving those goals may be different. Someone might be taking over the family business as an example, so you'll need to establish who's going to fulfill what role within that family business. You might have someone else who's certainly going to take care of the properties if they're using those properties more than others. And then end of life care, you might have someone in your family who lives nearby, or maybe they're in the medical field and maybe more apt to help with end of life care. Maybe that's their responsibility. In an ideal world, maybe you'd have, a property manager, a financial advisor, and a doctor within your family, and they could just take all three of those roles and split them up. But if not, just try to find out what each person's strengths and weaknesses are, and maybe you can account for that down the road. And if you do end up splitting your assets between three children three separate ways, at least everybody knows that we have equal roles, even if they're very different roles. Okay, so I think that's a really important conversation to have. Protecting assets that are worth protecting. After spending so much time building up your assets, it's natural to want to hold on to as much as you possibly can. However, with certain non-monetary assets, it's often prudent to think about how these assets will affect the next generation. So, for example, let's say you have a summer cottage up in Maine that you want to pass on. If you also have a large family, that could present a lot of issues. If you have one or two children, it might not seem like a problem, but let's just say you have 4 children, and consider that those 4 children might have children of their own someday. That's going to be a lot of people that have to split up just one property, especially since the cottage might only be able to use for 4 months out of the year, and they have to allocate their vacation time to deal with this. Could turn into a lot of different arguments. That's not to say that you can't pass down the property. You don't have to sell it, during your lifetime. You can to make it easier, but you don't have to. It's just important to discuss these types of concerns that may arise, such as scheduling and maintenance to that property, before you pass away. So, what assets do they want? What would they want to keep hold of? Again, you could account for that. Maybe somebody takes that cottage, but now they're no longer a beneficiary on one of your IRAs. If the math works on it and everybody's okay with it, that might be a consideration for you. But certainly trying to figure out how those assets will be transferred, protecting them. I've heard stories about properties that have sat for 6 months as this process got sorted out, and then of course, the pipes froze over the winter and created a lot of issues for repairs. And it's just these little conversations that can happen in advance that would really help to avoid those kinds of issues. Okay. And finally, just our 10th point here. Of course, I think we have to throw this one in here, expecting the unexpected. So wealth transfer plans really should be made assuming that they're going to change. They require a certain amount of flexibility, and natural and unforeseen events such as divorce and illness and marriage, birth or death are going to deeply affect your wealth transfer plans. So it can be helpful to do some practice runs of what you would do if one of these life events did occur, so that you're more prepared for these situations. So for example, how would you want to rearrange your will or your trust if you were to have another grandchild, or if your daughter who's currently single were to get married? Would that change anything? Would you want to allocate more funds to a certain family member or add another family member to your will? These are important questions to consider so that you can be ready for these in case of situations. Again, helping to make those decisions a little bit easier 10 years down the line while you're in the heat of the moment, if you've already kind of gone through that exercise to sit down with your estate attorney or sit down with a trustee of your account to really outline those kind of provisions. Okay. So that really wraps us up today. Again, as I mentioned, I promised I'd give you 2 resources here. I'm going to talk about those in a second. First, First National Corporation. Again, our website here, fncadvisor.com. A lot of resources on here. We've got webinars under the resources tab. So some of the same webinars that we've been doing are located there in addition to a few others. We've got a blog that we write here. And then one of the first resources I'll point you to, if you happen to be a dentist in this webinar, we have written an ebook for you. So if you go to that dentist tab and just enter your email there, we'll be able to email you a Kindle version of that. And this goes through several different wealth management topics. Today, we're really talking about Chapter 16, Leaving a Legacy. So if you want more detail on today's topic, that'll be where you go. But there's so many others, and maybe even, again, younger generations that you could pass this on to that, go over the basics of wealth building. And then some of these other topics are kind of more of the 45 to 60 range. And then once you're getting close to retirement, a lot of investment and tax strategies in there that you can certainly look into. I'd say 80% of this content is relevant for non-dentists as well. So don't be afraid to make a request for that book even if you're not a dentist. One other resource I just want to point you to, in the last year or so, we've actually created this checklist, which I've been using for, when my clients pass away and their children are taking over the estate, trying to provide them some sort of structure to deal with that. I'm sure there are, many other lists out there on the internet that you can find, but I do like this one. We've really tried to make this very simple and straightforward for what they need to be thinking about. And again, just go through, check. Yes, we've taken care of this. Yes, we've taken care of that. We've broken this down into the immediate versus 1 month out, what they should be doing. And then we've also got some phone numbers on here that would be really helpful, I think, for somebody who's going through this situation immediately and might need just a little bit of direction. So feel free to just email me if you'd like to get that PDF. We're happy to share that. Again, as we're kind of along these topics of estate planning and wealth transfer, this is, again, a nice little PDF to put into your toolbox. And then finally, I'll just point you to my last slide here. This is our information, again, fncadvisor.com/blog for those written articles. You can connect with me on LinkedIn to get notified of when those go up. Or again, if you want to request either the ebook or the PDF, the Survivor's Checklist, feel free to email me, Alex at FNC Advisor, or if you have other questions that we didn't address in the webinar today around the topics of wealth transfer, happy to talk about those one-on-one with you as well. So again, thanks everybody for joining us for the webinar today. Hope some of you found it helpful, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon at a future webinar. Thanks everyone.